Welcome to another edition of The Breakdown. We've got a really exciting episode this week because we've got some big things to talk about. There's the budget that's been announced, there's the budget cuts that have been announced, there's program changes to AISH that are going to have some huge impacts on people who live in our province. There's been some really significant changes made in regards to educational funding, but the really exciting news that we're really looking forward to talking about is the fact that, for those of you that don't know, the whole reason why we've been filming in this field for the last 6 months or so is because we've been trying to help draw attention to the fact that North Calgary desperately needs a new high school. Now, funding was announced for the school for just the design by the last government, but this government finally got off its bureaucratic ass and approved the funding for the new high school. So Calgary North is getting a new high school, which is exciting for a bunch of different reasons. The biggest one being now we can go out and play in other parts of the province. But there's one quick little thing I want to mention before we actually get into the bulk of the program, and that is it's about 2 to 3 years before the high school is going to actually get built and have students coming into it. Now, with the recent changes that the UCP government has made to the rules in regards to how quickly principals have to set up GSAs when there's been a request to the students that are likely going to be attending this school, I just want to say you should probably think about getting your applications in soon, because it might be a while before the GSA actually gets set up if you want to support LGBTQ youth in the province. It's time for the breakdown. So it's true, the new Calgary North High School has officially received full funding for construction. And this is a huge step because it means that kids who have historically had to spend 60 to 90 minutes a trip getting to other high schools in the city will now be able to go to high school right here in this field that we've been filming in for the last 6 months. And this is a huge win for the community. Now, that being said though, there's a couple of things about the announcement that I want to highlight, and it has to do with decorum. So one of the problems that the UCP unfortunately has had quite a bit over the last couple of weeks has to do with decorum, despite the fact that it was one of their campaign promises to restore decorum to government. They've had some challenges with that, whether or not its press secretary is getting in trouble for posting wonderful comments about constituents where they call them basement-dwelling mouth breathers, which is an interesting choice of words given that Premier Kenney claimed to have lived in his mom's basement for most of the time he was in Parliament, but I don't know if he's a mouth breather or not. But secondary to that, there were a couple of things specific to the announcement that happened. Now, I want to be really clear that as much as there's people across the board who are trying to take credit for the fact that the high school got built, there's one group in particular that carries the most water with this for sure, and that's the community advocates and volunteers who have been working for 15 years to try to get this school on the radar of the powers that be so that it would be built. They deserve the bulk of the credit, hands down, no questions asked. And there's a lot of different people who make up that group. But there is another person who deserves a little bit of credit who unfortunately didn't get any. Now, decorum is defined as sort of what's the best behavior, what's the highest moral road that you can take. And it seems like that certainly wasn't observed with this announcement. One of the big steps that got the North Calgary High School to the place where it was on the capital plan was the fact that the previous government, the NDP government, actually put forward the funding for the design funding. So all of the design money existed before the UCP announced the construction funding. Now, that was the result of one MLA working extremely hard to make sure that the school and the communities that needed it got the attention that deserved. And that's this guy, Jamie Kleinstruber. Now, Jamie didn't run in the last election, and he's largely stepped back from high-profile politics. And while I might have some political differences with him, he absolutely deserves a good chunk of the credit for getting to the school to where it is now. Which begs the question, if the UCP is so interested in decorum, and raising the bar and demonstrating what our behavior should look like, why wouldn't they have taken the opportunity to celebrate this development through the whole community and all the people involved instead of just not inviting Jamie? which is what they did. This guy put in an incredible amount of work, and he didn't get invited to the announcement of the school being built. That's partisan, and it doesn't make any sense, and it sure isn't the best example of decorum. So I just want to take a quick second to say, as a constituent of Calgary Northeast, and what was Calgary Northern Hills, which was Jamie's constituency, thank you so much for all of your hard work in getting to us to where we were so that the UCP could finish the race. One of the biggest groups that's going to be hit hardest by this budget, though, are post-secondary students. With over $117 million in cuts to post-secondary institutions, there's going to be some pretty significant impacts to kids who are going to post-secondary education, whether we're talking about colleges, universities, or even technical institutes. Schools like SAIT have gotten huge cuts. The University of Calgary and the University of Alberta got some of the biggest cuts in this budget. Not only is this going to mean that tuition is very likely to go up significantly and unpredictably, but it also means that important infrastructure projects for those schools to keep them current aren't going to be able to happen. Given that post-secondary, whether we're talking about universities or trade schools or whatever the case may be, are some of the biggest sources of the future of our province and are the drivers of our province's economy, because that's where people go to learn the skills that they're going to use to diversify our economy and to support our economy and to do all the jobs and to build all of the infrastructure that we need. This is an incredibly short-sighted move by this government. As we've already talked about throughout this episode, the new provincial budget has made a lot of cuts and has announced the intention to make a lot of cuts that are going to affect a lot of Albertans. In particular, one of the areas that we wanted to talk about today was the impact that the provincial budget is going to have on first responders, particularly paramedics. So one of the things that the provincial government announced is that they're going to be seeking a 5% wage rollback for paramedics in upcoming contract negotiations as well as upcoming arbitration. They're also looking for rollbacks from nurses as well as a variety of people who work in healthcare. But today we're just going to talk about the paramedics side. Joining us today is senior plausible deniability correspondent Aaliyah Coleman, and hopefully we're going to be able to make a little bit more sense out of what's going on with this whole issue. So Aaliyah, what's your immediate reaction to hearing that paramedics across the province will be experiencing a 5% pay cut, or at least that's what the government's asking for?
Well, Nate, absolute rage. Like, absolute, like, in my stomach, just rage.
Okay, so given that, as the UCP likes to say, we need to get our fiscal house in order, and you know, there are people in the private sector who have suffered through this economic downturn. Don't you think it's appropriate that public employees as well take a, 5%? It's not that much.
But it is, though. And like, by not valuing such an essential service and the people that are providing it, like, what is that saying about the government's viewpoint on first responders and their livelihoods? Given,
Jason Kenney, when there were the fires up north during the summer, just this summer, there were some wildfires that affected quite a few Albertans. What's your interpretation of the fact that Kenney's cutting back? He was very quick to go and pose for pictures with those first responders. How do you feel about these cutbacks? And given that he's also cut back the repelling fire team, how genuine do you interpret his support of first responders to be?
I mean, I think everything that you just said really points to the fact that it's not genuine. He just wants to be relevant and be like, oh, I'm helping with this. Look at these fire people they're so great and stuff. But then behind closed doors, he's like, well, I want more money. You guys, not that important. 5%, what's 5%?
Do you think at all that the recent announcement by Joe Maglioka, Jeremy Farkas, and Sean Chu, that they think that all City and Calgary employees should take a 5% pay cut, which includes fire and the Calgary Police having to deal with some significant budget shortfalls because of the new provincial budget. Do you think that these guys were inspired at all by the UCP cuts using the exact same numbers?
Well, I think they're following suit. They're following kind of the guidelines that they've been given, like provincially, and they're just now carrying that out locally.
Do you think that there's any concern there's been a lot of media coverage over the last couple of years over the fact that paramedics are dealing with insufficient resources, as some media articles have cited, and certainly their union has said. There's certainly concerns about PTSD. Do you think that having to process a government saying that there's going to be a 5% pay cut to practitioners and paramedics. Do you think that that is going to have a positive or a negative outcome on their overall workplace morale?
I think it's going to have a profoundly negative impact.
Okay. So would you be willing to argue then that this announcement of the 5% rollback is actively going to hurt paramedics?
Yeah, it's more than the money. It's saying what the government says that their inherent value is, and that is less than what they're already getting, which is not like paramedics were, really up there in the first place. It's going to be noticeable, and the paramedics are going to feel that cut.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah. Aaliyah Coleman, Senior Plausible Deniability Correspondent. Unfortunately, though, with this provincial budget, one of the biggest groups of people that have been most targeted, it seems, are the most vulnerable of Albertans. One of the groups that we're going to talk about today are folks who receive AISH. AISH, for those of you that don't know, is Assisted Income for the Severely Handicapped. And it's a program that's designed to make sure that people who aren't able to work enough to provide for themselves because of a severe handicap are still able to make ends meet. They're still able to be productive members of society. Now, last year, the entire legislature voted unanimously to increase AISH based on something called indexing. So what indexing is every year AISH would get a slight increase to make sure that it was increasing at the same rate as the cost of living or inflation in our province. This is a really important thing because if we don't have indexing for AISH payments, then AISH payments stay the same while everything else gets way more expensive. And when we're talking about people who are only getting under $1,700 a month to pay for all of their needs, that's not nearly enough to get by, especially as those cost of living increases continue to go up. In order to try to get a better understanding of how this indexing issue is going to directly affect Albertans in ways that are going to end up costing other Albertans even more money, we sat down with a couple people who are receiving AISH payments. This is their story. We're very fortunate tonight to be joined by Conan. Conan is somebody who's been on AISH for more than a decade, almost two, and he's joining us tonight to talk a little bit about the impacts of the low funding levels of AISH, and in particular the decision by the UCP government to de-index AISH, despite the fact that less than a year ago they voted unanimously to make sure that AISH was indexed to inflation rates. So Conan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
What's your immediate reaction when you hear that the UCP government is planning on de-indexing AISH?
My immediate reaction was, I don't have enough to survive as it is. How am I going to survive? Like, if you rent a place in Calgary, you know that rent is over $1,000. We don't get much over $1,000 to live. How can anyone in their right mind think that this is a good idea?
Okay. Do you find that the current levels of AISH are sufficient?
Not at all.
Not at all?
Like I said, you can't even rent a house or a place in Calgary for what they're giving us to live on in a month. It wouldn't even pay rent. Like if let's say there were no subsidies and there were there shouldn't have to be subsidies anyway. We should have enough to live on, not exist, live.
Now, one of the things that sometimes people say about AISH, and to be clear, I don't agree with that, but one of the things that sometimes people say about people on AISH is that they're just looking for a free ride. How do you respond when you hear things like that?
Those are the same types of people that have no idea what they're talking about because they're not in our predicament.
When you hear people characterize the current AISH schedule as it's going to be going forward with no increases for the foreseeable future, when you hear that characterized as still being the most generous in Canada, how does that make you feel?
Well, first of all, I think that's just a guilt trip that our governments lay on us, because if you were in BC, they'd say, oh yeah, well, we have this or we have that, right? It's just a way, it's an illusion or a guilt trip.
What would you like to convey to, if you had the Premier here and you had the Minister of Community and Social Services here, what would you want to say to them about de-indexing AISH?
Well, the first thing I would say to them is that I am grateful to have a disability pension, so that they understand that, I do appreciate what I have. However, it would be much more helpful if you gave us enough to live on. And here's why. The more we have, the more we can also put back into the economy to help out our communities, to help out our province, to help out our country, to help out our, you know, and so on and so on. The more money somebody has, the more they can help out.
Have you ever encountered challenges with AISH or with your funding levels where you've had to make difficult choices about medications or food or anything like that?
All the time. In fact, I still do. You know, and I can remember very well in 2003 where most nights I did not eat supper because I didn't have enough money. I was too hungry in the morning, so I would eat when I got up, and then, you know, or sometimes I'd eat a big lunch, but that was all I could afford. Now, if somebody thinks that that's a good idea, I'm going to ask them to do it themselves.
Do you still
see
face
how they feel?
Do you still face those sort of choices today?
At times, yes, I do. Especially with the rising costs of everything. I mean, disability has not at all matched inflation, and we've been told a lot of things that are untrue.
I want to say thank you so much for being willing to take your time and to come out and share your perspective on this.
Well, no problem. I just want to say to anybody listening that I am grateful for every opportunity that I have, and I am grateful for every dollar that I have. So, I certainly am a peacekeeper, but what I feel is important is that, we need to be evolving. And by all these cuts, which started back when Klein was in power, we have not evolved at all for a long time, and that needs to be changed.
Thank you so much for your time, Conan.
Thank you.
Now, before we show you our next interview, in the interest of full disclosure, I just wanted to put a couple things out in the open. So first of all, I do actually know the next person that we're going to interview. Her name's Tammy. She used to be one of my neighbors, actually. She lived down the street from us. Unfortunately, several months ago, Tammy had to move out of our community because her husband fell ill, and because of the financial restrictions that AISH has placed on her, she was no longer able to afford to live where she was living. She had to move to a lower rent area so that she could still keep a roof over her kid's head, as you're going to hear how is very important to her. We're sitting down now with Tammy. We're very fortunate to be chatting with Tammy. Tammy is somebody who's been on AISH for a little while now, and we're here to ask her for her thoughts on the situation with the indexing. So first of all, Tammy, thank you very much for agreeing to chat with us.
You're welcome.
So with the developments that have happened, the new government has decided, contrary to what their voting record was, to de-index AISH. Mm-hmm. What's your reaction to that as an AISH recipient?
Well, first I had to look up to see what de-indexing meant.
Okay.
Because the first I'd heard is they were like lowering our payments. And then when I discovered what it meant is that, in other words, for the next 4 years, our AISH payments do not raise with the cost of living.
Yeah.
First of all, AISH recipients got their first raise on January 1st, 2019, since 2012.
Yeah.
And, we're going to be de-indexed in the next year by $30 a month, and then it's going to go to just under $100 a month. 2023, we're going to be de-indexed as far as buying power by $120 a month, which is actually going to put us further back than what recipients were getting in 2012, because January 1st, 2019, AISH was raised by just under $100 a month. So 2023, we're losing $120 buying power. That's actually going to put us way backwards.
Yeah.
And it's going to drastically affect being able to keep a roof over our head. Utility bills, they are going up. Our income is not. Groceries are going up. Our income is not. Low-income bus passes, which the city is looking at a proposal right now to raise the low-income bus passes as of January 1st of this year from $5.50 to just over $18. It's going to create a lot of problems, and it has a trickle-down effect and tentacles everywhere, because it's going to, for somebody who can't work a first job, let alone get a second job. Yeah,
There's no
we
real ways
feel
for
like
you
the
to-
government is putting their foot on our head.
Okay.
And why we do feel like we're being picked on, because we have no chance of getting around it, above it, simply because we're not able to work. So we are at the mercy of the government.
Okay. Does this change create any uncertainty for you? We talked to a gentleman earlier tonight who was talking about how he's had to, in the past, and still sometimes has to make very difficult choices about what he is willing to sacrifice in order to make ends meet.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, first and foremost, I'm raising a child. I have to have that roof over our head. You know, that's $1,200 a month.
Yeah.
I have to have electricity. I have to have heat to keep her warm and be able to feed her. But the groceries definitely take a kick. Things like having access to a cell phone, and mine's only $40 a month. It's still going to take a kick. And unfortunately, I still have to utilize the food bank approximately every 3-4 months.
Even with the AISH payments
Even
you're
with
having
the
to go to
AISH
food
right
bank.
now.
Okay. Do you think that the government is, I mean, one of the characterizations that the Premier has used is he's described Alberta's AISH payments as being the most
The
generous.
most generous in Canada.
In Canada. How do you respond when you hear the amount of money that you get that you're barely scraping by on, that you're needing to go to the food bank? How do you respond to somebody characterizing that as being generous?
Alberta was, I'm going to say was, a very, very rich province when it was in the oil boom.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that bothers me is he's also said that he's raised the AISH supports by 11%. But the thing is there's more and more people going on to AISH, and that's where that money's going.
Yeah. So more people are getting a low level of help.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not, we're all getting a higher standard of help where we can actually live as opposed to exist. Because if you have to worry so much about just the basics, you know, shelter insecurity, food insecurity, heating insecurity, lights insecurity, that's only an existence. There's no life. Mm-hmm. There's no room for any life. Most people on AISH can't even afford a cup of coffee from McDonald's because their money is so micromanaged. It has to be in order for us to survive.
Do you think that with some minor adjustments, including not de-indexing AISH, do you think that would have a more positive impact on the mental health component for AISH?
Are you asking if the way things are, is it?
Could it be better? Like, does it have a negative impact the way the conversation's being had right now?
It has a very negative impact.
Okay.
And I truly believe there's going to be more involvement of things like children's services, domestic violence, crime, and suicide.
Because of all those stressors from that financial insecurity.
Yeah. Because the other thing is a lot of society thinks that when people are on AISH that we get everything covered for us. We don't. I'm supposed to be on a medication right now to help with chronic pain and depression that no insurance covers, including AISH, that is over $100 a month. So do you think I'm on it?
So you're not able to get the medication that a physician has determined is the most appropriate medication for your conditions.
That's right.
And it's not covered by AISH.
No.
Okay. Do you think that there's an argument to be made that if the province invested in supporting people who are in situations like yours more effectively, that they would, in the long run, end up saving taxpayers' money?
I do, because it would take more pressure off the healthcare system.
Okay.
And on the mental health care, the mental health system.
Okay. If you could say anything to the Premier, if you could say anything to the Minister of Community and Social Services, what would you want them to know about how their decisions are impacting your situation?
The decisions they are making are destroying disabled families.
Okay.
Because we have no way to get our head above water. None. Because like I said, not only can we not, in most cases, work a first job, we can't work a second. Or, we're at the government's mercy. And that's why it does feel like we are being stepped on.
Do you feel like the government's treating people with disabilities as people, or do you feel like they're viewing the AISH program and people with disabilities more as a burden that needs to be dealt with, as opposed to?
I feel that we are being treated as a burden and somewhat disposable.
Okay.
Because why don't our basic rights count as much as, say, somebody who's not disabled? And and it's frustrating because it's not just the AISH that's being de-indexed. It's things like the closing down of a lot of satellite CNIB offices for the blind, closing down the store for CNIB clients here in Calgary, which means we have no way to purchase our canes, the assistive devices we need in order to live an everyday life.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
You're welcome.
And hopefully helping to bring a little bit more perspective to the conversation that's happening in our province, and maybe even hopefully getting to the words, the ears of the Premier and the Minister, so that maybe they can reevaluate some of these changes they're making, because they very clearly do have serious impacts.
They do. I certainly hope so.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to just wrap up this whole little segment on AISH here, there's just two things that I wanted to quickly draw your attention to in the previous videos. The first one is the fact that both of the people that we interviewed have never met each other, but they both made it very, very clear that one of the biggest things that they want is the ability to not just exist, but to actually be able to live a meaningful life despite their disabilities. And I don't think that's something that's out of reach for our province to be able to help them with. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that neither of these people are looking for a free ride. They're both looking for ways that they can contribute to society and ways that they can still be a part of society. But the financial restrictions that the province has chosen to put on them and roll back on them are making that even harder. We can do a lot better as a province. For our deep dive this week, we wanted to take a look at an issue that is starting to get quite a bit of attention, not only in Alberta, but outside of the province, and that is the issue of WEXIT. Kind of surprising that we're actually having to have this conversation, but we are, so here we go. Basically, what WEXIT is it's a movement that's been around for quite some time. The idea of Alberta independence has been around for a very, very long time. But it seems to have certainly gotten more social media and media attention since the federal election. And in fact, one of the big WEXITer memes was around the fact that if Justin Trudeau was reelected, then they were going to really push for a separatist movement. Now, there's a whole lot to unpack with the whole WEXIT piece, and that's what we're going to try to do here. Now, before we really get into the nuances and the technicalities of what WEXIT is or could potentially be, there's a couple of things that it's really important to acknowledge. And the first thing that's really important to acknowledge is that this movement, as misguided as it may be, comes from a place of deep emotional response. The bottom line is a lot of people that are looking at WEXIT as an option are extremely frustrated, they're extremely angry, and they are extremely tired of feeling like they don't matter. So this is coming from a very strong place of insecurity, and it's coming from a place of people literally just trying to take back control over their lives because they feel like they've lost it. So it's really important to realize that when we're talking about WEXIT, we're talking about people who feel like they don't have any control over what's happening to them, and they want to try to get some of that control back. When we start to take a look at who the driving figures are for the WEXIT movement, it becomes even more clear how important it is to understand that place of insecurity and that need to take back some level of control. Because the figurehead for the WEXIT movement is a guy named Peter Downing. Now, Peter Downing has a really interesting history, but you can see the common threads all the way through it, where this is a guy who's trying to assert control, maybe from a place of insecurity. So he's run for the Christian Heritage Party, which is a fundamentalist Christian political party that's trying to bring fundamentalist Christian values to government because they don't feel like they have enough control over how government does business. More importantly, though, he used to be an RCMP officer. And as much as he likes to say that he was an RCMP officer that left with a clean record, there's a little bit of gray area in there that needs to be examined. When we're talking about Peter Downing's RCMP record, before he left, he had several complaints against him that were currently under investigation. Now, they were internal complaints to the RCMP, so one of the big suspected reasons why he left the way he did when he did is because if he left before those investigations were concluded, he would be able to leave with a clean record. So there were still things that were being under investigation. Peter Downing is also somebody who has been charged and convicted of uttering threats, and he tried to appeal those charges but lost that appeal. It's also worth noting when we're talking about Peter Downing's history and whether or not he's an appropriate leader for the WEXIT movement, this is a guy who had complaints against him from his wife because he threatened to throw her out of a window. So again, when we have somebody where they've had issues with bullying, they've had issues with uttering threats, this is somebody who is very much looking to take control. And the danger of that is when you have people whose primary motives is control, they aren't necessarily looking about how the thing is supposed to work in the first place. Now, there are three main principles to the WEXIT movement. This is separate from their platform. This is sort of their guiding light. And those three things are, first of all, taxation. They believe that citizens should only pay taxes for services that are considered essential services. Now, they don't really define what essential services are, but the tone of the WEXIT movement seems to suggest that there's too many social services that the average taxpayer has to pay for, which is a little bit problematic because when we're talking about people who receive social services, like for example AISH, they would be very happy to argue that those services are absolutely essential for them. The next piece is they believe very strongly in social stability. But again, this is another place where the wording gets really, really important because what they say is Western civilization is the bedrock of social stability. Now, the phrasing there is really interesting because they're choosing specifically Western civilization. The implication of that is that anything that isn't Western civilization doesn't contribute to social stability. And this is where it starts to get really, really dangerous for the WEXIT movement because it almost starts to appeal to some people who don't believe in immigration. Which brings us to the last piece of the WEXIT guiding principles, and that's that they believe that a sovereign Alberta should not be beholden to any other countries or any other laws, to the point where they even say that they reject any sort of laws that the United Nations makes. Now, this is a really, really important one because it gets important for part of the conversation that we're going to have in a little bit. But just remember, the WEXITers don't believe that the UN should have any say over what Alberta does as a country. The platform of WEXIT is also particularly telling in regards to who they're trying to appeal to. Now, again, I said earlier that the WEXITer folks are people who are trying to take back control over things that they lost control of, and a big piece of that has to do with the economy. The harsh reality that Albertans are going to have to come to terms with is that our oil and gas industry is never going to explode like it has in the past. All of the infrastructure that companies need to get oil sands products out of the oil sands already exists. So a lot of those jobs are never going to come back. But a big part of what the WEXITers are trying to appeal to is that frustration and that sense of loss. And try to keep that in mind as we go through some of their big platform points here. So they want to fully abolish wind and solar power. They want to create an Alberta workforce that is 100% only residents of Alberta. Now, it doesn't say specifically what the criteria of a resident of Alberta is, but again, it has that very locked down, no no external people coming in approach that's, again, trying to take control. They have punitive measures against organizations blocking Canada's economic progress. We don't know what economic progress is defined as. Presumably it's more of the oil and gas, and we don't know what those punitive measures would be. But it's certainly a compelling argument to be made that it's very hard to build a strong economy when you're telling companies that if you don't do what you want them to do, there's going to be punitive measures placed against them. One of the other big issues that exists within the WEXIT platform is the whole piece around them wanting to outlaw any group that creates or whose effect is social or racial agitation. And the effect word is really important in this particular policy piece because the effect of something can be very different for very different people. There are some people who will see somebody walking down the street in a niqab or in a turban and they aren't bothered by that at all. But as we've seen through social media posts, there's plenty of people who will get very, very upset when they see things that aren't in their own cultural paradigms, and they'll call people out on the streets and they'll say incredibly racist things. So the question then becomes, who's causing that social or racial turbulence? That's one of the reasons why this policy in particular is particularly concerning. Added on to that is the fact that it really seems to fly against their policy of free speech on the internet, because if you're allowed to say or do anything you want on the internet without any restrictions, one would think those same rules would apply outside of the internet, but it seems like these two things are in conflict. But one of the biggest problems that exists with the whole WEXIT movement is that there's a whole lot of misinformation that's going around in regards to what a possible succession from Canada would look like. And this is where it becomes really incumbent to hold the leaders of the WEXIT movement to account, because they're saying some things that simply aren't true. For example, one of the biggest obstacles to the whole WEXIT movement is the fact that every square inch of Alberta is under treaty law. Treaties were made across the province that were made well before the province even existed as a province. Those treaties hold sway over Alberta as a province. And you would never be able to get Alberta to secede unless you got every single treaty member to agree that they were okay with stepping away from Canada as a country. Now, what that means is they'd be asking First Nations folks to be giving up what little guarantees that they have and what supports they get from the federal government within those treaties. It's really important to realize that these treaties aren't just Alberta law, they aren't just Canada law, they are in fact international law. And Canada as a country and a signatory to those treaties has a responsibility to enforce those treaties. That includes the military. And speaking of the military, one of the arguments that we hear Wexiteers make from time to time is the notion that in order for Alberta to build a military, all Alberta would have to do is just claim the space that exists for military bases, and members of the Canadian forces could just choose to stay inside of Alberta and become part of the new Alberta military. That's really problematic for a lot of different reasons. First of all, the equipment that's on those military bases belongs to the government of Canada. It belongs to the Canadian military. So it's not like we can just claim all of that equipment, whether we're talking about tanks or CF-18s or whatever the case may be. We can't just claim that as equipment is now belonging to Alberta. The other important thing to realize is that a lot of the military personnel that are currently stationed in Alberta aren't necessarily from Alberta. There's a lot of force bases in Alberta that are used very heavily for training. So we get people from all across Canada. So to think that these people would be willing to effectively commit treason against their own country and abandon their posts within the military universe to leave their areas where they live in Canada and join Alberta just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, one of the other complications that Alberta as a country would have to deal with if we were an independent country is the fact that we would be entirely landlocked. Now, there's two main arguments that Wexiters like to use in order to try to get around that. The first one is we just take the top half of northern British Columbia and then we'd have access to tidewater, we'd be fine. There's some very real legal problems that exist with that. So first of all, even if you could convince the people who live in British Columbia to join the WEXIT movement, and leave British Columbia and leave Canada, There are huge areas of British Columbia that are called unceded territories. Basically what that means is when Canada became a country, they didn't necessarily sign treaties with the First Nations that lived on that land. And so the legal status of that land is very, very much up in question. And until that question gets resolved, it would be impossible for anybody to claim that land as now part of the WEXIT country, whatever it would be called. The other big argument that Wexiters use to try to deal with the whole question of how an Alberta landlocked would get product to market and still have access to the sea is, ironically enough, a United Nations rule. So now this is where it gets really confusing, because if you take a look at the rule that we're talking about, it's called Article 125 of Conventions on Land and Sea. I'm probably getting the title not quite right. But basically what it says is that any landlocked state still has access to transit through other states. That's the article that people like to use to say, oh, well, we'd still be able to build our pipelines. There's two big problems with that. First of all, one of the main tenets of the WEXIT platform, as we talked about earlier, is the fact that they reject the UN's authority on everything. So how you can, on one hand, say, well, we'd use this UN law to still be able to have access to the sea, but we're not going to respect any UN laws, is a little bit problematic, to say the least. The other thing that we run into with this whole argument is that you have to read the whole document. Because if you read the whole document, what it actually says, it clearly defines what those modes of transit are. And nowhere in there is the word pipeline. And in fact, if you take a look at what the actual article says about pipelines, it clearly states that while pipelines should happen and can happen, it makes it very, very clear that in order for those pipelines to happen, it has to happen with negotiation through other states. And those other states have the ability to refuse those based on those other states' own interests. So the idea that the United Nations Convention would be a golden ticket to get pipelines built simply isn't true. Now, if there's anything to be taken away from breaking down the Wexiters principles and from breaking down the Wexiters platform and talking about the United Nations Convention, the biggest takeaway from this whole thing is that right now what we have happening is a bunch of people who are really angry and really frustrated, and legitimately so, trying to take control over their lives again, but they're doing it in a way where they're just sort of reaching from all of these different corners without fully understanding what the ramifications and what the processes look like. So in order to find out what a constitutional secession would actually look like and what the major roadblocks are, rather than just speculate on our own, we decided to reach out to a constitutional lawyer who practices in this area to answer some of these questions. Welcome to another one of our interview segments here on The Breakdown. Given that we're talking about the whole WEXIT movement, we decided that it would probably be a good idea to go to a source of information that actually knows what the legalities of a potential separation from Canada would look like and what the constitutional implications are. So I'm very, very thrilled to welcome to The Breakdown today, David Kahn.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you. So to start with, the first question that I'd like to ask is, before we contacted you, we tried to find a practicing constitutional lawyer who would be able to speak on the pro-WEXIT side. We haven't found anyone. Do you think there's a reason for that?
I think there's probably a reason for that, and that is that it'll be very difficult for Alberta to separate, and legally. Number one, and I think just number two, there's so many problems with a separate Alberta. These are not the answers to the problems. It'll just make the problems that we're facing in Alberta a lot worse. So I don't even think that anyone has really seriously studied the issue.
Okay. Is there, in your opinion, do you think that there is an existing legal pathway that the WEXIT folks could pursue in order to separate, if that's what their end goal is?
I think hypothetically there's the example of Quebec and the 1995 Quebec secession reference, and so there's the Supreme Court has laid out a sort of structure by which a province could pursue separation. That includes having a referendum, having a clear question, having a clear majority voting in support of a clear question in support of separation.
Okay.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg. that would trigger constitutional negotiations between the federal government and the provincial Alberta government and all the other provincial governments in terms of a whole array of questions that would have to be answered. So that a clear question and a clear vote to separate is just the start.
Okay, so that would only, if I understand correctly, that would only trigger the negotiation process.
Yeah.
And there's no guarantee that negotiation process would end in separation or in a positive separation for Alberta. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Right, and I mean, so many of the cards would be arrayed against an Alberta negotiating separatism, so separating from the country. So there's so many of the cards are held with the federal government and the other provinces, geographically, economically, fiscally. The list just goes on.
Okay, so with that, there's a couple of points that it seems like the Wexiters or Wexiteers, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, that they keep bringing up. In regards to how they would navigate some of those challenges. One of the big ones that vaguely gets mentioned is some sort of UN convention guaranteeing a landlocked state access to the sea. Do you know what that's referring to?
Yeah, so there's an Article 125 in a UN convention that hypothetically allows a landlocked state to have access to the ocean. But first of all, I find it highly ironic that these Wexiteers or these separatists are quoting a UN convention, because the group of people that supports Wexit is largely the group of people that attacks the UN and international law and federal law and frankly any laws that are developed outside of Alberta. So it's quite rich that they're quoting that UN treaty.
Yeah, I saw on their platform it specifically states that they would reject the UN's authority in anything. So I'm curious how they would reconcile that with then invoking this UN law. But if they were able to do both of those things at the same time, what does this Article 125 allow for?
Yeah, so it's called right of access to and from the sea and freedom of transit.
Okay.
The problem is that it only allows for right of access in negotiation with the state next door that you're negotiating access to the sea by, and it actually only and transport is actually just described in the treaty as railway, rolling stock, sea, lake, and river craft, or porters and pack animals.
Okay.
So those are the only means of transport that are directly referenced.
So pipelines aren't included in that then?
Well, there's another section that says that transport pipelines and gas lines and means of transport other than those listed that I've just mentioned can be negotiated. But negotiated. So they're optional means of transport that can be negotiated between states. The other really important thing about this is it does give the states that are being negotiated with to gain transport access across have to have explicit protections for their legitimate interests.
Okay.
And that would have to be decided by an international court as to what legitimate interests are. But you can imagine that they could be environmental interests, human rights interests, First Nations interests.
Okay.
So there's a whole negotiation that would have to be undertaken as to what those legitimate interests are.
Okay.
And we've seen the BC government, for example,
not super pro-pipeline these days.
no, and exert all sorts of interests, some more legitimate than others, in opposition to TMX, for example.
Is there the possibility, I know that BC and Canada are trying to work their way through the whole question of unceded territories in British Columbia. Given the unresolved status of a lot of those pieces, would that be one of those interests that BC could theoretically invoke to prevent a pipeline from crossing?
Right, well, so one of the reasons that Northern Gateway failed is not the constitutional duty to consult, which is embedded in Section 35 of our Constitution, that cannot be overridden by the notwithstanding clause or any other section of the Constitution. It's standalone protection of Indigenous rights and title, that requires this duty to consult, and that's what failed on Northern Gateway, and that's really why Northern Gateway failed. I mean, it was put out of its misery by Prime Minister Trudeau after the 2015 election, but it was not going anywhere because most of that land over which the Northern Gateway pipeline would have crossed is unceded territory, as you say. So most of the land west of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia has never been subject of treaties concluded with First Nations to share the land. Most land east of the Rockies, right across the country, is the subject of historical 19th century, early 20th century treaties, but that BC land isn't. So that's one of the real problems with resource projects and putting pipelines through BC, especially northern BC, is we haven't concluded land resource sharing and land sharing agreements with those First Nations.
Okay. One of the other talking points that I've seen the WEXITeers bring forward a lot is they seem to be working very hard to create a positive relationship of sorts with First Nations in Alberta. Now, my understanding is a lot of that comes from the fact that all of Alberta is covered by treaties. Almost all of them supersede the formation of Alberta. So they carry a little bit more authority on not just a national scale, but on an international scale. Do you think it's realistic for the WEXITeers to believe that they'll be able to convince First Nations to sign away their existing treaty rights and the responsibilities that the federal government has to them, and to just trust this new group of folks?
Well, that's a great point, Nathan. For example, where we live here in southern Alberta is covered by Treaty 7, which was concluded in 1877. So, roughly 30 years before Alberta was even created. So those First Nations signed Treaty 7 with the Queen Victoria and the Crown in right of Canada, the federal Crown. So that's who the treaties are with. Now, when Alberta was created, some of the control over lands was transferred to Alberta in the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement.
Okay.
But they're subject to the promises and the treaty promises that the federal Crown has made with First Nations. So it's not within the capacity of Alberta to separate and just exit from those treaties, because they're not a party to those treaties, and their control over Alberta Crown lands is actually subject to those promises that were made to First Nations by the federal Crown. So it's very complicated, and as you said, as you alluded, those treaty rights are constitutionally protected by our federal constitution, and why groups of First Nations would want to forego those constitutionally protected protections and join a new entity that probably has a constitution that's crafted that doesn't have those protections is a really good point.
Okay. In the hypothetical situation that I've seen advocated for on some of the WEXIT groups, there's been the argument that we could just take the land. Who would be the first line responsible for protecting First Nations rights if a group of Albertanians decided that they were just going to occupy First Nations land?
Well, the federal government has the jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians, so they have the constitutional jurisdiction over Indian reserve lands. But broader than that is all of Alberta land is treaty land that's been shared with First Nations. So all of the promises to First Nations for hunting, trapping, fishing, and otherwise using Crown lands across the province would be protected by the federal Crown.
Okay.
So it's plus the we may get into this, but the federal government has purview over defense. So all of the military bases in Alberta, all of the military assets are all federal assets. So there's a real question as to how these Albertanians would take land by force.
Yeah, and that does lead to sort of one of the other topics that I wanted to talk about, because one of the other things that's come up on some of these WEXIT boards is the notion that, well, in order to create an Alberta military defense force, the the military people who are in Alberta could just stay, and we would just keep them in their toys. How feasible is that?
Well, those bases, those lands, those are all federal lands.
Okay.
Those are all federal employees, federal assets, and so those would stay with the federal government pending some negotiation with Alberta that was wanting to separate.
Okay.
But I think those negotiations would be very steep. For example, we'd owe 70, 80, 90 billion dollars worth of the federal debt, and interest payments would go up even on our own provincial debt, because we wouldn't get the same access to the same interest rates as Canada does. The other thing that's really concerning about this whole WEXIT separation is this kind of notion that we can unilaterally separate, and if we can't, we're going to take up arms. I'm no historian, but I saw someone on Facebook pointing out that the fact that apparently the U.S. Civil War was started because there was disputes over military bases in the South that were controlled by the federal government, and fight disputes over federal military bases. So this is a really, really dangerous path to go down.
With the military piece, if there was a soldier who was employed by the Canadian Forces who did decide to join the Alberta Stanian Army, wouldn't that count as desertion and carry some pretty strict penalties under military code?
I'm not a military lawyer,
Okay.
so I really couldn't answer that from a legal perspective, but just from a layman's perspective, I think there's some pretty serious consequences for desertion. And
The next question that I have for you is well with that. How is this whole WEXIT conversation not getting anywhere near the land of treason? How what's the delineation for, the WEXITeers can have their rally up in Edmonton, and they can openly talk about not wanting to be part of Canada anymore. They can hang the Canadian flag upside down from hockey sticks. Where does the behavior cross the line from your exercising your freedom of expression to you now cross the path to treason?
well, that's a tricky conversation to have. I'm a big believer in free speech and charter rights to free speech. And also I'm a big believer in self-determination of people. So if Albertans vote on a clear question, vote in favor of separation, then they have a right to self-determination. And so I'm not sure, and I also don't believe that we should be I think enforcing laws such as treason are really antiquated and really dangerous for civil society. But what people do have to realize is there's real consequences to your actions. There's consequences. You can say whatever you want, but there's consequences to exercising your free speech rights. There's responsibilities. Similarly, if you want to separate, there's rights and responsibilities there to the other. The rest of the population in Canada, to the other territorial, provincial, and federal governments. So there's a huge amount of responsibilities that would be undertaken by a new state of Alberta.
Okay. One of the big issues that seems to drive a lot of the frustration and a lot of the anger that is kind of the undercurrent to this whole movement has to do with the question of equalization. So how much do you think that some of the rhetoric that we've heard around equalization and the misinformation, whether deliberate or accidental, in regards to how equalization actually works, has contributed to what we're seeing with the WEXIT thing?
Yeah, that's frustrating because people are being told that it's money that we're sending via check from Alberta to Ottawa or to the other provinces. what equalization is a federal program funded out of federal taxes. We all pay federal taxes, and the federal government decides how to use that revenue. And so it's a federal program, and the federal government has developed a very complicated formula as to how to distribute money so that
I believe our current premier was even part of the development of that formula.
Yeah, the formula that was renewed by the federal Liberal government was developed by Stephen Harper and Jason Kenney when they were in power. Yeah. It's a complicated way the federal government has devised to try to allocate federal funds to other jurisdictions that don't have the same resources and tax generating powers, so that they can pay for programs and services, so that if you're in a poorer part of the country, you can get a similar level of services as if you're in a richer part of the country, because we believe that Canadians should have fairly equitable access to important social and health services.
Do you think that there's a reasonable argument to be made that if Albertans have paid a disproportionate amount into the general revenues, which in turn has then gone towards the equalization payments, that doesn't necessarily speak to anything other than how fortunate Albertans have been in regards to what they've been generating for income over the last however many years versus the rest of the country?
Yeah, so average salaries in Alberta are far higher than in any other part of the country, so we automatically pay more federal taxes per capita than anyone else. So we automatically are paying more into the federal government's revenues per capita than other provinces. There is a real, I think, a legitimate grievance about the severe downturn in our oil and gas economy that we've had since 2015, since the crash of world oil prices, and the real struggles that many Albertans are facing these days. And in our Alberta Liberal platform, we actually had a careful and specific plan for renegotiating the equalization formula, for example, to take into account hydro revenue in hydro-producing provinces. So BC, Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland all produce large amounts of hydropower, but they're produced by their crown hydro corporations, Hydro-Quebec, BC Hydro, Manitoba Hydro. So those revenues and profits are kept within the crown corporations, and then dividends are paid to those provincial governments, and that revenue is not properly calculated in the current equalization formula. So I think there's ways of improving the formula to make it fair to Alberta, especially in these times of downturn where we could use some more help from the federal government. So there's definitely a place for that. But as you pointed out, it was Mr. Kenney's and Mr. Harper's cabinet that originally negotiated this equalization formula, and he's lately been defending that by saying, oh well, it was boom times in Alberta back then, so times have changed now. But I don't think it's fair to say that in boom times it was fine to suck more money out of Alberta, but times have changed now. I think it should have been equitably designed from the start, and just because we were
doing disproportionately well.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that was a time for Mr. Kenney and Mr. Harper to suck more money out of Alberta. So I don't think it's a very fair defense.
Mr. Kenney has talked a lot about equalization. He certainly used it to some people's perspectives as a wedge issue going into the provincial election. And I think that there's probably some people who would say that he exploited people's lack of understanding as to how equalization actually works. He's recently started chatting more about the prospect of an equalization referendum if he doesn't get everything that he wants. What's the constitutional, does that accomplish anything constitutionally? If we get Albertans to pay for this referendum, which may or may not happen concurrently with civic elections, does that change anything for Albertans fundamentally?
Well, yeah, I'm disappointed to see that Mr. Kenney's been raising that more vociferously lately in Twitter and in interviews and speeches. It's a complete waste of time, and as I said in the debate during the election, it's pure political theater. There's nothing good that can come of a referendum on the equalization formula. First of all, the principle of equalization is built into our Constitution. And as we know, it's very difficult to change our Constitution. We went through Meech Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Accords. We were younger when these were happened, but people older than us will remember what a waste of time those were. So his idea is to have a referendum on equalization based on the Quebec secession reference, forcing the opening of the Constitution and a renegotiation of the Constitution. That's just not going to happen. The formula itself is not embedded in the Constitution. That's why the Harper government last tweaked it or built it in its current form. That can be changed, but it can be changed unilaterally by the federal government. Provinces have no say in that because it's a federal program. It's all federal money that's being used to support that the equalization program. So we can vote till we're blue in the face about demanding a change in the Constitution to remove equalization or demanding a change in the formula, but we have no power in that regard.
Okay. The last question that I wanted to ask, given that you as a constitutional lawyer have a much higher level of understanding of the mechanisms that would conceivably come into play on a separation question, do you think that the people who are leading this movement are legitimately believing that they're going to accomplish anything, or is this more political theater?
I think people like Peter Downing and some of these luminaries in the WEXIT movement are completely misled and uneducated about our Constitution and how and the Quebec secession reference and how that might work. They're uneducated about the costs that Alberta would incur if it were to separate. They're uneducated about the real problems a separate Alberta would be if it was stuck in the middle of North America with no access to any treaties, not being a party to any regional or multilateral treaties in the world, not having any access to a coastline, not having a national bank, not being part of a G7 country. There's a whole host of things that they just don't seem to understand. That's those people that are developing this separation movement. I think they just don't understand the situation. But there's people like radio hosts in Alberta, columnists in Alberta and in Canada that are fanning these flames, certain provincial politicians, and they do understand these issues. Mr. Kenney was in the federal cabinet for 10 years as a cabinet minister and has been an MP for much longer than that before becoming an MLA and premier of the province. He knows full well how the Constitution works. He knows full well how international agreements work, how pipelines get built, how the G7 economies work, how the federal bank works, how much of the federal debt would be assignable to an independent Alberta. So that's really disappointing to me that people like Mr. Kenney and very high-profile people in the media continue to push this when they know better.
Would it be safe to say that the people who do know better, whether we're talking about radio hosts, whether we're talking about politicians, whether we're talking about premiers, would it be safe to say that they're deliberately misleading Albertans for their own political gain? And would it be safe to use the term predators when describing these people when they're taking advantage of the average person who doesn't have a background in constitutional law and their understanding of what these issues actually are?
I've never used the word predator, but I'm very concerned with their actions and how they are exploiting a lack of understanding by ordinary Albertans of how our country works, how the world works, how the economy works, how the oil and gas industry works. But they're also exploiting the real serious concerns and worries that ordinary Albertans have. So they're exploiting both a lack of education and understanding and a real concern that many people have about the future of our province and their jobs and their families. And those politicians are exploiting that for their own personal political gain and don't have the best interests of not only Canada, but they don't even have the best interests of Alberta at heart. Because, you know, one thing that we haven't discussed here, but I think is one of the biggest problems with this whole thing is all of this talk of separation is scaring away international investment. We have a perfect model in Quebec in the 70s and 80s where capital fled that province because of the uncertainty created by the separatist movement there. Why we'd want to go through that now, why we'd want to further scare away international capital and international
capital
investors.
Migrate anyways.
Yeah, so they're making the situation worse. And exploiting Albertans and their real fears about the future for their own political gain, and I think that's, you know, one of the most serious issues that we have here.
Okay, so you wouldn't call them predators, but exploitive.
Yeah,
I'll call them predators, and I don't have a problem with that. Totally predators. Thank you so much for your time, David. I appreciate you coming up here, driving up in the terrible weather, and being a part of this silly little experiment that we're trying to do here.
Oh, I'm really happy to be a part of it. I love joining podcasts. There's a number of your podcast co-hosts that I've had the real privilege to be involved with. So I really appreciate the invite, and I'm glad to make it up here on this snowy evening.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks,
You have a
David.
good night.
Good to see you again.
One of the things that we got a lot of pushback on with our last episode was the whole piece on Canada Action. And that's where we did a deep dive into Canada Action. And we were actually able to demonstrate that there's some pretty deep ties between Canada Action and UCP MLAs and ministers. Some of them we maintain are really quite alarming. Well, that dovetails in quite nicely to a segment that we did months and months ago where we were talking about whether or not it was a conflict of interest for a minister and an MLA in the UCP government to potentially be still working for an oil consulting company. That minister was Razan Sani, and she had at the time on her LinkedIn, she had listed herself as being a vice president for a company called FracMod. There's their website right there. She also was still listed on the company website as being the vice president, despite the fact that it had been more than a few months since she was elected. So we raised some questions about that. Now, we never got a straight answer from Razan on any of those things. She did change both the website and her LinkedIn after our segment, but we never got a straight answer. One of the things that we were told to wait for, though, from people in the world was that we needed to wait to see what her submission to the Office of the Ethics Commissioner of Alberta was. In case you don't know, anybody who's elected has to put forward a disclosure to the Office of the Ethics Commissioner. Now, Razan really took her time in getting hers in. She was one of the last 5 or 6 MLAs to get it in, but she finally did a couple weeks ago. And so we were able to take a look, and we were able to see that she's no longer consulting for FracMod. So yay, we got an answer to that. But when we were reading it, we got another question, unfortunately. So if you take a look at page 7 of that disclosure, because it says that she still is working for a different company whose website looks eerily familiar as a consultant, and she still is getting revenue. So we did try to reach out to Razan and say, hey, can you clarify what page 7 is all about? Unsurprisingly, much like our invitation to the high school, we didn't get an answer. So I guess it's up in the air at this point whether or not we have a minister who is heavily advocating for oil and gas, whose government is making economic choices that heavily help oil and gas, but she's still potentially consulting for them. We don't know. So that's it for this episode of The Breakdown. It's a bit of a landmark episode for us because we've spent the last 6 months filming in this field trying to draw attention to just how much our communities needed a high school in North Calgary. And we're there. The funding's been approved. Building's going to be starting soon. So we don't really have to stay in this field anymore. So we're going to go explore the big bad world. But let me be really, really clear. We are by no means done. We're just getting started, and we have some really exciting plans I'm really looking forward to for how we're going to be keeping going with The Breakdown going forward. So we'll see you at the next episode. Wait for me. Did we get that? That was recorded? How did I start? Huh. Let's do that again. Ah. So it's true. Further. Yep. But no, I train wrecked that. We'll do it again. Picking sides. Let me do that again. Millions and millions and millions. Really challenging week for the UCP. Loud trucks. I almost fell over when I said that. And it's the balancing pool. Exerting. Or just Berta. It's Berta. We live in Berta. The balancing board, friggin' frack, the thing. Alberta balancing pool. Calgary Northeast and Minuter. TikTok. Let's do that again. So it's true. There's different ways to pronounce X's too. Okay. It gets really important to remember what we were talking about. Is they believe very strongly that the country or the state of Alberta, Stan, probably wouldn't be that because of the Western Society thing. We'll do that again. One of the main arguments. That's good.